The following program is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network, available on the free YouTube channel General Grant by Himself by Dr. E.C. Fields, on the Facebook page Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and on various other social media. Permission to copy and distribute is given and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now another in the ongoing series of General Grant Looks at the American Civil War, wherein General Grant reflects upon his son Fred being wounded in the Vicksburg Campaign. I am General of the Army Ulysses S. Grant, and you join me today in the library as I reflect about my son Fred being wounded in the Vicksburg Campaign at the Battle of Big Black River, the bridge. Fred had been with me for a good bit of campaigning. I had him with me at Camp Yates in Springfield, Illinois. And when I got orders for us to move the 21st Illinois Regiment to Missouri, to go to Quincy, Illinois and cross into Missouri, I felt that Julia would probably want Fred back home and out of a combat area. So I put him on a boat back to Galena. He was bound for Dubuque and then he'd catch a train for Galena. And I put him on the boat. I promptly got a return from Julia that said, "Leave the boy be, keep him with you." But that was too late. Fred was already on the river heading for Dubuque, Iowa. As time passed, when we were beginning to move into Mississippi, or down the Mississippi into Mississippi and go for Vicksburg, Admiral Porter and I were planning the running of the Vicksburg batteries in April, probably mid-April. And I called for Julia to bring the children down to Memphis. And Fred begged and wheedled and pleaded to be allowed to be taken out of school and come down and join me. And his mother, to my surprise, his mother agreed. So he was pulled out of school. They came down to Memphis and actually were with me on the Baron von Phul, P-H-U-L, on the river, and watched the running of the batteries by Admiral Porter's convoy. And he stayed with me for the campaign. Now, I had him with me the day that Admiral Porter was shelling Port Gibson there at Grand Gulf. And Porter's Navy took quite a beating, several direct hits. And we went on his flagship, the Benton, and they'd taken a direct hit amidships in the gun deck and killed several sailors and seriously wounded many others. And Fred got his first real taste of seeing what war looked like when he got on that boat with me and saw those men, the dead men and the ghastly wounded men. I really don't think it affected Fred much. As I have found out later, it did. In fact, Admiral Porter had taken a wound. A piece of shrapnel had hit him in the back of his head during that shelling, and he manfully, though, was very decent to Fred. And in fact, I think teased Fred a little bit and asked him if he wanted to join the gun crew to replace one of the gunners that had been killed. Fred was 12 years old at this time, and he demurred and said, "Well, I really don't think my father would allow me to join the Navy." And we went about our business. As we went on down to cross the river on April 30th and May 1st, we moved on immediately the next day, May the 1st, toward Port Gibson, and quite the fight had erupted. It was called Thompson Station as well. But what I had done the morning after we had gotten across the river and McClernand had moved the 13th Corps up with some other troops that had been brought across the river after McClernand crossed. Quite the battle erupted. I slipped off the gunboat that we were on and left Fred asleep. And I expected, as anybody would, that he'll just stay here. He can't find me. Well, when the battle noise grew louder, Fred woke up and he looked around and realized what had happened. So even though he had people that were supposed to be watching him, as you know children can do, particularly when the adults get busy with something else, Fred slipped off the boat. And he went to, I'm pleased to say, the sound of the guns. He knew which way to follow. There's the road right there at Bruin's Landing, and he went up that road following the battle because he knew he would find me at some point. He also joined up as he did his walking with Charles Dana. And Mr. Dana has been sent down, I know, everybody on my staff knows. Dana's been sent down by the Secretary of War, Stanton. He's Assistant Secretary of War, frankly, to spy on me. Stanton wants to know if I'm drinking and allegedly drunk. He wants to know how I'm conducting my command and on and on. I have instructed all of my staff, treat him with the utmost kindness, make him feel welcome. But he's just recently arrived with us. But he has been left along the side of the road too. So he meets Fred and they both start walking up the road toward the battle. Along the road, they ran into some federal officers who recognized Fred. He's got his own little uniform, Yankee soldier uniform, and they had captured some horses because I didn't bring any horses across, only those needed to pull artillery and wagons. I was even walking initially, or in a carriage. And they had found two really old horses that were white, and white with age. So they gave Mr. Dana, Assistant Secretary of War, when he identified himself, and my son, each a horse. And then they scrounged around and found some saddles and bridles, which were as old and worn out as were the horses, and began walking to find me. Well, when they did find me, my impression was such a ragamuffin, worn out excuse for horses and people that I laughed out loud. I laughed heartily out loud at the sight of that boy and that man on those two old, worn out horses with that tack that they were using. And it was at this point that I realized that Fred was going to be with me, and I had no fear. Neither my wife nor myself had any fear of Fred being with me, and he handled himself well. I felt that he would have the opportunity to see many, many things that at such a young age that he would never have the opportunity to see at a more mature age. I thought it would do him good, and I had no concerns for his fear. I did tell him consistently, be careful, Fred. And of course, with a 12-year-old, you know that went in one ear and out the other, and he wanted to see the excitement. And he got to see a lot of excitement, some a bit closer than he wanted. Well, after we had fought the Battle of Edward Station, or Port Gibson, Fred said this about it, later on about it. He said, after the battle, while riding towards Edward Station, Fort Gibson, Father suddenly turned back and I went on into a house filled with Confederate wounded, which was the Isaac Roberts house. They were not feeling very friendly toward the Yankees and they threatened to kill me. Of course, I decided not to intrude and I passed on. Further down the road, some of our own men who did not know me attempted to take me prisoner. Soon, however, an old soldier recognized me and called for 3 cheers for young Grant, which were given with a will, and I began to feel more comfortable. About midnight, I returned to the field, and reached a house in which I found my father and several of his staff officers, most of whom were greatly elated over their victory. I slept in the room with my father that night, he even after the great battle and victory of that day, and with the expectation and cares of another battle on the morrow, was, as ever, most considerate of the comfort and the welfare of his young son. Father always cared for and about me. But after that, the next day, Fred also had this to say. I joined a detachment which was collecting the dead for burial. But sickening at the sights, I made my way with another detachment which was gathering the wounded for a hospital to a log house which had been appropriated for a hospital. Here the scenes were so terrible that I became faint and ill, and making my way to a tree, sat down, the most woebegone 12-year-old lad in America. Fred didn't say anything about these sights to me at the time, and I did not know that they were impressing him so deeply. But he was a 12-year-old boy, precocious, energetic, dynamic, intelligent, but he was 12 years old, and he was seeing the horrors of war at their most horrible. After those battles, Raymond, and moving on to Jackson, he had gotten with Sylvanus Cadwallader, the journalist. And I know not where Dana had gone by this time, but Fred was now with Sylvanus Cadwallader, and it's on the 14th, and we're going into Jackson. We took Jackson, but Fred thought we had already taken Jackson and that it was completely in our hands. And Cadwallader says that they had started for the capital at full speed to secure the large Confederate flag which waves from the staff on the roof, only to meet someone coming down the steps as they were racing up the steps. And he says, a ragged, muddy, begrimed cavalryman descending with the coveted prize under his arm. To say that our disappointment was extreme, but mildly expresses the state of our feelings. So Fred and Cadwallader did not get the rebel flag flying above the state capitol building in Jackson, Mississippi, but Fred didn't give up. He was looking for a trophy. And so he was darting around all over the Jackson, Mississippi State Capitol building, and he found his way into the office of the governor, Governor Pettus. And Fred said he saw the governor's pipe abandoned on his desk. And goes on to say, I confiscated it, ostensibly for the national service, but actually for my own private use. It had the advantage of being still loaded and lighted. So apparently Governor Pettus had vacated that office, but moments, if not minutes, before Fred got there. And as he was going into Jackson, he saw Confederate soldiers coming out of the city, and he realized, we have not completely taken the city yet. And he was greatly in fear of being captured or killed, but he said that I was so muddy and filthy that it covered the blue of my uniform, and the rebel soldiers going past me took no notice of me. And he sat his horse there while they marched past him, and then he found Cadwallader and stayed with him. After Jackson, going back to Champion Hill, and then the next day into Big Black River, it's when he was wounded. We were pushing them on the 17th back across the Big Black River and to the bridge. And I was determined that I was going to push them so hard and so quickly that they weren't going to have an opportunity to fire the bridge. Fred was all over the battlefield. I found out later he had a better mount now. And he got with Brigadier General Mike Lawler's brigade. Now, Mike Lawler is an Irishman about 6 feet 3 or 4 inches tall. And remember, this is the average man in my army is 5 feet 6 inches tall. I am 5'8", so I'm a bit taller than the average man. But Mike Lawler pushed 6'4" and weighed well over 250 pounds. A big red-headed Irishman that he liked to take off his coat and roll it up and tie it behind his saddle, wear a straw hat and roll up his sleeves. And his slogan was, "If you see a head, knock it." So he had a brigade there as we're pushing the rebels back to the river, and there was a cotton field right between the river and the woods. The rebels had chopped down a number of trees to open up a field of fire, so the woods were even further back from the river. But there was a swale where the river had formerly run, which was deep enough for a man to be in, and Lawler took his brigade, broke them out of the woods, and ran into that swale. And they were but yards from the Confederates. Lawler roared, spurred his horse and up out of the swale, and they were upon the Confederates that so fast that they barely had an opportunity to get off. In fact, they did not get off a volley. Very few men were killed. And in the second wave, nobody was, to my knowledge, was injured. And the rebels fell back to the river. Fred got so excited with this that he spurred his horse up into the former rebel works to see what was going on. And he says this about that. Following the retreating Confederates to the Big Black, I was watching some of them swim the river when a sharpshooter on the opposite bank fired at me and hit me in the leg, hit him in his right thigh, grazed him. The wound was slight but very painful, and I suppose I was very pale, for Colonel Lago, Clark Lago, came dashing up and asked what was the matter. I promptly said, "I am killed." Perhaps because I was only a boy, the colonel presumed to doubt my word and said, "Move your toes," which I did with success. He then recommended our hasty retreat, and this we accomplished in good order. Fred's wound was not serious. It was a graze, but it became very painful and it became infected. And in fact, my surgeon, Dr. Henry Hewitt, said, we need to amputate that leg. And I was disturbed about this, and so was Fred, and prevailed on Dr. Hewitt to do all he might before resorting to the extreme amputation route. And he did not amputate. He treated Fred, and Fred was okay with the leg. After the surrender, when we went into Vicksburg, Fred was with me. And we went to a house where Pemberton and a number of members of his staff were, and rode up to the house. But I'd like to tell you what Fred said about that encounter. And he says, we reached a house of some pretentious appearance, partially built of stone. There was an assemblage of Confederate officers upon the porch. General Grant dismounted at this place and entered. No one met him at the gate or asked him to take a seat among them. General Pemberton was there with his staff. but he received his conqueror in a most frigid, cold manner. After a moment, General Grant said, "I would like a drink of water. Where can I find it?" One young officer, more politely inclined than others, pointed to the door of the house and said, "I presume you will find a glass of water inside the house." General Grant went back through the house and entered the kitchen. I followed him. There was an old negress who gave us the coveted drink. Perhaps our enemies assembled there did not realize that that same morning my father had interfered with any firing or saluting in exultation over the victory. Unfortunately for Fred, Julia, and myself, and William Sherman, Fred got a bug in his stomach, and so did Sherman's children. Sherman brought his wife and 4 children to Vicksburg as well. And Sherman's son, Willie, was but 9 years old and got something in his stomach that caused dysentery. And in October, he was in the Gayoso House Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, and died suddenly. Fred also had caught a bug in his stomach and was having dysentery problems that plagued him all the way through December and into January. Julia was with me in Nashville where I had gone after the Chattanooga campaign. And she was called back to St. Louis, where Fred was, with her cousin Louisa Boggs. And that's the Boggs of Boggs and Grant. Her husband and I had the real estate business for a few months in St. Louis before the war, back in '59. But Louisa told Julia, "You need to come back." And Fred had wasted away almost to nothing but a skeleton. Julia telegraphed me on January the 17th and told me, if you want to see Fred alive, you need to get back to St. Louis. I telegraphed General Halleck and asked permission to see Fred, who was sick with, as I told General Halleck, typhoid pneumonia. General Halleck gave me permission to go, but Secretary Stanton said that I could not relinquish my command to anyone else. I had to stay in command on a daily basis, so I took my personal telegrapher, Samuel H. Hewitt, with me, and I telegraphed and stayed in command of my troops at all times while I was gone. When I got to St. Louis on the 26th, I left Chattanooga on the 24th and went through Nashville, got to St. Louis on the 26th. When I got there, Fred had passed his crisis, but he was a piteous sight to see. He was almost 13 and almost only skin and bone. The dysentery had worn him away to nothing, and the pneumonia that he caught, which was common, it was called typhoid pneumonia, but it was a result of being so weakened by the dysentery and the typhoid. But Fred managed to pull through, and Sherman's son Willie, at age 9, had died back, as I said, back in October. So Sherman and I both had children to suffer from something they picked up from apparently the water in Vicksburg, and Sherman lost his son. Julia and I were fortunate. We did not lose our boy, but he was fine. Julia had gone to the doctor right before I got there. The regular doctor had to be out of town. His partner came out and examined Fred and prescribed him Nox vomitica, which is something to clear out the intestines, and he gave a good dose of that to Fred. That may have been what turned the course around for Fred. But on the 27th, the day after I got back to St. Louis, I actually took everybody out to the St. Louis Theater, and we saw the stage play Richelieu and enjoyed it immensely. And on the 27th, I telegraphed General Halleck that my son's crisis had passed and that I would be returning to my headquarters. And on March the 1st, I wrote my father a letter in Covington, Kentucky. And father and mother did not want Fred with me at all during the campaign. They had objected strenuously when Julia brought him with her to take him to me. But I wrote father a letter and in part told father, Fred is now with me, quite recovered. The doctor said that he would not be strong enough to send to school until next fall, and for that reason, I am keeping him with me for the next few weeks. So by March the 1st, Fred had improved to the point that he was able to travel and be with me and begin recovering. So I very nearly lost my son to a Confederate sharpshooter at the Battle of Big Black River, then to a possible amputation, and then to dysentery and pneumonia resulting from dysentery. Fred stayed and went back to St. Louis and went back to school and stayed there pretty much for the rest of the war. A note of interest that I might add is that John McClernand's son, Edward John McClernand, and Fred both began West Point in 1866. So Fred did not speak of his relationship with McClernand. I wonder how they handled that. But John McClernand's son and my son both went to West Point together in the class of 1870. But I have reflected quite enough for this time together. I hope that you see fit to join me again for other reflections and how General Grant looks at the American Civil War.